Some people were asking if I could talk more about the history of Screamo and how it's changed over time specifically. I guess I would start by saying that I kind of divide Screamo into four eras in my mind. The first era is like 1990s, pre like Screamo term time. And then following that, you get pop Screamo explosion of the 2000s. And that's followed by this Scrams reformation, which happens in like the late aughts into the early 2010s. Those periods definitely overlap. In fact, all of these periods kind of overlap a little bit. There's not like hard boundaries to them. And I'll get more into that as we talk through each time period specifically. And then the fourth era of Screamo, I would say, is just the modern era of Screamo, which is kind of like the last 10 years-ish. And I think we'll probably just go like chronologically from the beginning up until now, and I'll kind of get into details about how everything's changed. Screamo, when it starts, is basically still just part of the hardcore scene, right? The first bands that we now call Screamo bands were just called hardcore back then, or punk bands. Nobody really bothered to differentiate, and even when I was growing up in kind of like the early 2000s, I think that was still oftentimes the case. Like, you didn't run into too many people who had kind of like a distinct term for that kind of punk music. That would not really become apparent to me or popular, I think, amongst people that I knew probably until like 2009, 2010 ish. So almost, 16 years ago. If you said Screamo to me in, 2005, I would have thought you meant, I don't know, My Chemical Romance or something like that. But anyway, the 1990s, you've got early 90s, late 80s bands that are forming the scene all over the place in California, DC area, in the Northeast. Some of those bands we've talked about on the show before, like Indian Summer or like Universal Order of Armageddon. Groundwork is a band that I kind of consider to be like a early Screamo band, although they were definitely kind of like metalcore influenced as well. Swing Kids is another band that people talk about when they talk about really early Screamo. As they grew in popularity, I think those bands quickly distinguished themselves from the scenes that they were participating in a lot of times, which were usually scenes that had a lot of hardcore bands in them. And it didn't sound like hardcore, and I think they faced a lot of adversity because of that. People were judging the music that they were making. It was a new style. It was a new approach to creating a punk music, and it was controversial at first. By the mid to late 90s, you start seeing bands like, City of Caterpillar and Page 99 and Seisha, and some of the really like legendary Screamo bands are starting to form, and that's partially in response to the growing popularity of Screamo bands, but also stuff like Midwest emo, which is now becoming a thing, and math rock, which is also becoming a thing. Yaphet Kotto is kind of another like mid to late 90s Screamo band that crops up. And then in 1999, essentially everything changes, or 2000, those 2 years, because you have probably a lot of albums, but two that really jump to mind are like the first Jimmy Eat World album as an emo album, and then also the first At the Drive-In album. Those records are some of the most popular in the genre to date. They're major label releases. Hearing at least Jimmy Eat World on the radio, I can't personally remember hearing At the Drive-In on the radio, but maybe you were hearing that occasionally. And similar, I think, to the Nirvana boom in the early 90s, you start seeing major labels going after more bands that have this kind of sound. And that means that we've entered the new era, which is like the pop Screamo era, when Screamo becomes Screamo as most people know it as Screamo. This is a time period when bands like Red Jumpsuit Apparatus have like giant hits that are going to the top of the Billboard charts. Everybody likes Screamo to some extent, especially something that was like really popular definitely with preteen and teen girls at the time in particular. And there's a whole culture of promotion that crops up around this too. It becomes very commercialized. Vans Warped Tour is a thing. If you ever got a chance to go to Vans Warped Tour, part of the reason why it was so cheap is because it was basically like a giant advertisement for a bunch of different products, and there was just stuff everywhere that was being hawked to you. Sometimes you would get stuff for free too, which was nice. But yeah, I mean, like the commercialization of it was very evident. So as like the 2000s progressed, this becomes sort of a more and more desperate thing that I think a lot of labels are holding on to, bigger labels are holding on to. And as social media starts to become more and more of a factor, you start seeing a lot of these bands moving toward basically just being like pop music cover bands or doing punk goes pop type stuff. Even if they weren't explicitly covering pop songs that already existed, the sound was getting a lot poppier. You started to hear a lot of bands experimenting with electronic music in a way that didn't feel super creative. Felt sort of like it was just trying to ape a lot of EDM sound of the time. At that point, I think a lot of bands that had been kind of active through that period as late 90s, early aughts Screamo bands that weren't pop Screamo started to pick up more popularity again, because I think a lot of people who had been into the pop Screamo movement were getting really tired of the crass commercialization of it, the extreme poppiness of it. Suddenly you started to see a whole lot of reinvigorated interest in bands like Seisha and City of Caterpillar, and some of the more kind of like, I guess, avant-garde, more like pop Screamo bands also start picking up speed. Like Circle Takes the Square jumps to mind. There's like a whole new birth of these bands that have lower production quality, much harsher compositional approach, tons of dissonance, very little clean singing, if any, and just very technical playing a lot of the times. And when it's not technical, extremely harsh. And that's kind of when we start to bleed into the era of like the Scrams reformation, which is when you start hearing people use the term Scrams, I think in particular because they're trying to differentiate between this like extremely poppy sound, which had become known as Screamo at that point. This is kind of when I was getting interested in Screamo. There was a huge wealth of bands at that time that were experimenting with that sound. It was definitely not the same that it was today, where in like you would hear bands that had sort of more metalcore and mathcore influence in their sound back then, but it was not as commonplace. Mixing things together that produced more of a, like, I would say Seisha inspired sound was definitely more popular. A lot more attention being paid to like harmony than you see in the modern Screamo era. And we'll get into like what that's been exchanged for in a second. You're seeing bands in this time period like, I don't know, Boys and Sex and Snowing out of Philadelphia, or The Saddest Landscape in Connecticut, Old Gray, La Dispute, Loma Prieta. Maybe around the mid 2010s, there started to be sort of a drop off in popularity of Screamo. Bands were just not as commonplace. If you kind of look at like Rate Your Music during that time period, it gets real quiet. A lot of people I know moved on to doing like noise rock or math rock type stuff. The Scram sound specifically was starting to get abandoned by a lot of people. And I think the resurgence in it really came from a lot of bands that were still doing it, starting to experiment more with incorporating like a metalcore, mathcore sounds into their music, getting way more harsh and heavy and kind of like metal inspired, I think, in a lot of cases, and also just like hardcore inspired. And that puts us kind of in the modern Screamo era, which I think is still evolving and growing more popular. There's been a resurgence in popularity of heavy music, I think, in general, in probably the last 5 years-ish. And in terms of what that looks like, I think it remains to be seen. One trend that I'm noticing is that there's a lot more shoegaze influence and nu metal influence bleeding into most Screamo bands these days, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I like that sound too. It's definitely like a popular thing at this moment. It's been done before, but it's becoming more in vogue for sure. In terms of where we're heading, I mean, it remains to be seen, but like, I hope you got some information out of this and heard about some bands that you want to check out now. Thanks for tuning in.